Rome didn't fall because it ran out of great men. It fell because it reached a point where being great simply wasn't enough anymore. We tend to picture him in marble, this serene philosopher king, sitting calmly above it all, and that picture is wrong. He was actually writing from a campaign tent on the frozen Danube, and by the point, the rot had already set in. Money, borders, and power, all three of them falling at the same time. The plague had emptied out his legions. The treasury was gone, to the point that he was auctioning off imperial jewelry just to pay for the wars. And one of his own generals declared himself emperor on nothing more than a rumor that he died. The most capable man that Rome ever produced couldn't stop what was happening. And once the system starts failing faster than any single leader can fix it, even greatness only really buys you a little more time. The pattern isn't some dead piece of ancient history either. You're watching a version of it play out right now. Welcome back to The Roman Pattern. I'm your host, Jeremy Ryan Slate, CEO of Command Your Brand. And you can check us out over at commandyourbrand.com. And now, our story. This is the episode the whole series has been building towards. We've spent a lot of time down in the late Empire so far, working through the collapse, the crisis of the 3rd century, Diocletian, all the final splits. But there's one specific reign where you can actually watch the pattern become visible for the first time. Not the pattern already breaking everything, but the pattern just emerging, showing itself clearly before anyone could really put a name to it. And that's Marcus Aurelius, who ruled from 161 to 180 AD. And before we go back to the Republic to figure out how Rome even got to this point, I want to stop right here, at the peak. At the moment when everything should have been fine. Most people look at Marcus Aurelius and they see a success story. The philosopher emperor, the best version of what Roman government could produce. And I want you to look at that same reign and see something else entirely. This is the first time that all three fault lines, money, borders, and power, opened at the same time. And it's the clearest proof we have that individual competence, even at its absolute maximum, can't rescue a system that's already failing. If you've been following along, a lot of this connects back to episodes that we've already done. The money side of it ties into episode 109, the political breakdown ties into episode 99. And the whole competent emperor problem is something we got into back in episode 103, when we covered Justinian. And if you're new here, don't worry. Everything you actually need is in this one. So let's start at the beginning. When Marcus became emperor in 161, the Roman Empire was about as vast and stable as it had been in generations. It wasn't quite at its all-time territorial peak. That actually came decades earlier under Trajan. But by any normal standard, he inherited a Rome at its height. He was taking it over from the 4 emperors in a row who had, by any reasonable measure, done the job well. Nerva, then Trajan, then Hadrian, then Antoninus Pius. 4 of them back-to-back, with no civil wars, and no succession crisis in between. There's somewhere around 65 years of one thing actually working. The system that made all of them possible was adoption and succession. When an emperor picked his heir, he didn't just default to a biological son. He looked at the men available to him, tested them, and adopted whoever seemed most capable. That's how Trajan came up. Nerva had no son of his own, so he looked at the men around him and adopted Trajan purely on ability. Hadrian was adopted by Trajan, though that one's actually a little murky, because the adoption only got announced by Trajan's wife after he was already dead, and even people at the time quietly wondered if he had been arranged after the fact. Then Hadrian adopted Antoninus Pius, and Antoninus Pius adopted Marcus Aurelius. Trajan had pushed the empire out to its absolute limit, deep into Dacia, all the way into Mesopotamia, more territory than any emperor before him held or any emperor after him held. Hadrian inherited all of that, and then deliberately pulled back. He spent his reign touring the provinces, building walls, tightening up what Rome already had. He'd already come to the conclusion that the empire had reached the limit of what it could actually be governed. So instead of trying to grow it, he put everything into stabilizing it. Then comes Antoninus Pius. 23 years on the throne with no major wars, no financial crisis, no serious revolts. It's almost uniquely quiet for Roman history. And that's what Marcus stepped into. Although, he didn't step into it alone. If you sat down and deliberately designed a system to produce the ideal leader, Marcus is what it looks like when the system works exactly right. And what followed was still decline. Slow, well-handled, but decline all the same. That's the first thing to really sit with here. The system wasn't breaking because the wrong man was in charge. It was already compromised down at the foundations, long before Marcus ever showed up. He inherited what looked like a peak, and underneath that peak, the foundations had quietly been working against themselves for decades. In 161, the same year Marcus took over, all three of those fault lines opened up. And not gradually, not one after another, but all three of them at once. So let me take you through each one. In 165, soldiers came home from a campaign out east, and brought something back with them. Some kind of disease, most likely smallpox. Through the ancient descriptions just aren't detailed enough for anyone to completely be sure. It moved through the legions first, then into the cities, and then out along the trade routes. So the same roads that made Roman commerce possible were now spreading the thing at incredible speed. Cassius Dio gives us a number here. 2,000 people a day dying in the city of Rome alone at the very worst of it. Now, he's actually describing a later wave of the same plague around 189, which is after Marcus was already dead, and he lived through that one himself. So it's a real eyewitness figure. It just belongs to the second round, not the first. Over about 15 years, the usual estimate is that it killed somewhere between 5 and 10% of everyone in the empire. Although the honest answer is that we don't really know. Walter Scheidel and others have shown the ancient data just won't pin it down tightly. And the guesses run anywhere from a few percent up to a quarter of the population in the places hit hardest. But even the low end of that is catastrophic. So let's be precise about what actually broke here. The Roman economy ran on agricultural labor. Farms needed workers. And once the workers started dying, the farms produced less. And once the farms produced less, the tax revenue fell right along with it. The military ran on recruitment, and recruits came out of that same population, the one that had just lost something like 1 person in 10, and disproportionately the working-age men that you'd actually want in a legion. So Marcus is suddenly dealing with 2 resource failures at the same time. The tax base is collapsing underneath him, and the pool of men he can pull soldiers from is shrinking. And this is happening at the exact same moment that the empire needs more money for its borders and more soldiers out on the frontier. So what's striking is how disciplined his response actually was. He didn't do what later emperors would do and just gut the currency. He trimmed the silver in the coinage a little, but never resorted to a wholesale debasement that came later. He didn't dump tax hikes onto a population that was already being wiped out by disease. Instead, he sold off imperial property. He auctioned palace furniture and jewelry. And he did it publicly, right there in the Forum of Trajan. Think about what that actually is. The Emperor of Rome, running a public auction of his own imperial collection just to pay the army. Our main source for this is the Historia Augusta, which you always have to take with a heavy grain of salt, because a good chunk of it is basically invented. But on this particular detail, it lines up with other accounts. 2 months of selling off imperial treasure, gold cups, silk, his wife's jewels, all of it, rather than squeeze a population that was already on its knees. That's not really a policy decision anymore. That's a man who has already run through every other option that he has. And it was still the right call. Wrecking the currency would only have sped up the financial collapse, and raising taxes on a devastated population would have gotten him a revolt. So he liquidated what he had, and held the line as best he could. And the plague just kept killing people. This is what systematic failure looks like in its early stages. You get the best possible responses from the person in charge, and the situation keeps getting worse anyway. In 166, that same year the plague was tearing through the legions, the northern frontier broke. The Germanic tribes came across the Danube. The Marcomanni were the biggest group, but they weren't acting alone. You had multiple tribes putting coordinated pressure on the whole Danube line at the same time, and that was something genuinely new. For most of Roman history, the pressure from outside had been pretty disorganized. Individual tribes would raid, Rome would absorb the raid, and then counterattack. And the initiative always stayed on the Roman side. What Marcus was facing from 166 on was coordinated, sustained pressure. This wasn't raiding anymore. It was closer to whole populations on the move. And his legions were already short-handed, because the plague had been killing off soldiers for a year at that point. His response really tells you where Roman power actually stood. He started recruiting freed slaves into the legions. He started recruiting gladiators, both of which were things Roman military tradition. Both of which were things the Roman military tradition really frowned on outside of an outright emergency. And he hired Germanic mercenaries to hold the whole sections of the frontier. Think about the logic of that for a second. The tribes pressing on the border were Germanic, and the solution he reached for was also Germanic. He hired frontier fighters from the very same population as the people he was fighting. It worked in the short term. It worked because Rome could pay more than these men could actually earn anywhere else. And it worked because Rome's ability to organize and command still held together. But it created a dependency. And the moment the money gets tight, which already was because of the plague, those same mercenaries turn into a very different kind of problem. Marcus held the frontier, though. He spent more than a decade personally commanding the Danube campaigns, not directing them comfortably from Rome, but out on the field, on the river, through the winters. And he made real progress. At certain points, he pushed the Marcomanni back a long way, far enough that he was actually considering turning Marcomannia into a Roman province. And that's not me speculating. Cassius Dio tells us straight out that Marcus meant to annex both Marcomannia and Sarmatia as new provinces, and probably would have if he'd just been given the time. But he could never quite finish it. The plague kept eating into the manpower that he had. The pressure on the treasury kept limiting what he could keep in the field. And every time he dealt with one stretch of the frontier, another stretch would thin out behind him. So the borders never actually fell, they just thinned. And thinning is honestly harder to deal with than an outright collapse, because thinning looks like something you're handling right up until the moment that you aren't. In 175, a rumor started spreading through the eastern provinces that Marcus Aurelius was dead. He wasn't, actually. He was seriously ill. The plague had hit him more than once over the years, but he'd pulled through. Out in Syria, though, before the truth caught up with the rumor, one of his generals, Avitus Cassius, had already made his move and declared himself emperor. And here's what matters about Cassius. This wasn't some outsider or disloyal opportunist sitting off on the margins. He was one of Marcus's most trusted commanders. He'd served with real distinction in the Parthian campaigns. He was respected by the Eastern legions, and he was exactly the kind of man the whole system was supposed to produce. The revolt lasted all of 3 months. Cassius got killed by one of his own officers once it became clear that Marcus was alive and the Eastern legions weren't going to stand with him. 3 months, and it was over. Most histories treat this as a minor footnote, a small rebellion that got put down quickly. And that framing completely misses what actually happened. The revolt didn't matter because it succeeded. It obviously didn't. It mattered because it happened at all. Marcus had spent 20 years building his authority on personal integrity, on being visible, obviously competent and honest, on leading from the front where everyone else could see it. And the second the system merely believed he was gone, not when he was actually gone, just thought that he might be, the whole institutional hold broke, and it broke instantly. And that's the power fault line right there. And it's less about the revolt itself than about what the revolt exposed. The stability was personal. It depended on Marcus, specifically him. And any system that depends on one person to hold it together simply doesn't outlive that person. Here's what separates Marcus from just about every other emperor caught in a crisis like this. He actually knew what was happening to him, and not just in the instinctive way that capable people can feel when something's going wrong. He understood it analytically. He had the training to read the failures as it was unfolding around him. His Stoic training had handed him a framework built almost precisely for conditions of loss. Because Stoicism was never really about feeling calm. It was about holding on to clear judgment when the outcomes are completely outside of your control. His teachers had talked to him directly about impermanence, about cycles, about the difference between what a leader can actually change and what he can't. And Marcus didn't treat any of that as metaphor. He applied it straight to Rome. He also had access to Roman records going back 4 centuries. He knew how the Republic had decayed. He knew how the Gracchi had tried to fix the deep problems and failed. He knew how Sulla had used the army to shatter constitutional rules, and how Caesar finished off all of what that decay had actually made possible. So he had the long view. He could see his own reign sitting right inside that same arc. Plagues had hit Rome before. The difference this time was that the earlier ones landed on a system that was still intact underneath. Pressure on the borders had existed for generations too. The difference now was Rome's ability to absorb it had been slipping for a long while. He understood the real problem wasn't the plague or the Marcomannic or Cassius. Those were just all symptoms. The real problem was in the structure itself. It came before him, and it was going to outlast him. That's a very particular kind of clarity to have to live inside of. There's another passage where he writes, "How many a Chrysippus, how many a Socrates, how many an Epictetus have time already swallowed up?" That's his own line out of the Meditations, the notebook he was keeping for absolutely no one but himself. He lists off these great thinkers and rulers, and points out that within a generation or two, even the most famous names come to mean nothing. And he's writing that while he personally holds the most powerful office in the Western world. That's not idle philosophical musing. That's a man who's looked hard at the historical record and concluded that what he's doing, however well he does it, is not going to hold. He wasn't writing the Meditations because he was serene. He was writing them because he understood, on some level, that he was losing. And the Stoic framework was the one tool the situation hadn't already stripped away from him. He couldn't fix the plague. He couldn't permanently seal the borders. He couldn't reverse the erosion of the institutions. But he could still control how he responded to all of it. And that's what he wrote about, at night, in a campaign tent, while he was still running the empire about as well as it could possibly be run. And this is the point where most people put the blame squarely on Marcus, because he's the one who broke the adoption succession rules. 4 emperors running had done it the right way, adopting non-biological heirs chosen for competence. The system working just like it was supposed to. Although Mary Beard makes a pretty sharp point about this in SPQR. There's a much less flattering way to read that streak, which is that none of those 4 emperors actually had a legitimate son who outlived him. So the adoption thing may not have been some stroke of principled genius. It may just be what you do when biology has left you with no other option. And Marcus happened to be the first emperor in a century who actually had a son of his own. Marcus had that son and named him co-emperor in 177, when the boy was around 15. His name was Lucius Aurelius Commodus. And Commodus became the sole emperor in 180 when Marcus died up on the Danube frontier. He was 18 at that point. Within about 2 years, his priorities were pretty clear. He shut down the Danube campaigns, left the frontier situation unresolved, went back to Rome, and handed the actual work of governing over to palace favorites, who mostly used that access to enrich themselves. Later on, he started appearing in the Colosseum as a gladiator. He renamed the city of Rome after himself, calling it Commodania. That is disputed, though. He renamed the months of the year after his own titles, and he executed senators who showed a little too much independence. And the thing is that Marcus seems to have known. The accounts from the time suggest he had real concerns about the boy. He wasn't blind to what his son actually was. He surrounded Commodus with experienced advisors. He made him co-emperor early on precisely so the kid would have time to learn how to govern under supervision. And none of it took. So why didn't Marcus just name someone else? That's the real question. The answer isn't flattering. Not to Marcus, and not to the system that boxed him in, just like that. The adoption succession had worked for 80 years, because the institutions underneath it actually supported it. The Senate accepted non-biological heirs. The military accepted them. The legitimacy was baked into the process itself, rather than resting on whoever happened to be making the pick. By 177, though, the whole foundation had been worn away. All through Marcus's reign, the Senate kept getting bypassed on the majority of military calls, simply because there were no other way to run things. You can't fight a Danube campaign by committee, and the military's loyalty had quietly become personal, tied to Marcus specifically. Because when you're the one out there holding the frontier for a decade, that loyalty starts flowing from the man instead of the office. So if Marcus had named some competent outsider as heir, Commodus would instantly have become a rival claimant. He already had his own supporters, people who'd spent years cultivating him precisely because he was the biological son, and his succession looked like a sure thing. So naming anyone else wasn't just really a succession decision. It was a decision to guarantee a civil war the instant that Marcus died. So Marcus weighed the two options against each other. On one side, a known, obviously unsuitable heir. On the other, a guaranteed power struggle that would wipe out 2 decades of stabilization the moment he was gone. He chose the least bad option in the short term, and that's the choice that ended up wrecking the empire over the long term. So Commodus wasn't really Marcus's mistake. Commodus was the system's mistake, just delivered through Marcus. All the institutional muscle that had made adoption succession possible in the first place, the Senate's real authority, the army's loyalty to the office itself, the legitimacy living inside the process, had already been ground down. He didn't break the system had already broken, and he was just making his choices standing in the wreckage of it. So let's put the whole 23-year picture together. Marcus was financially disciplined. He didn't just inflate his way out of the crisis. He sold off his own property before he'd pile on public debt. And while he did trim the silver in the coinage under pressure, he kept it from sliding into the kind of collapse that every incentive was pushing him towards. He was militarily effective. He held the Danube frontier. He put down the Cassius revolt without turning it into a drawn-out civil war. And he cleared Germanic tribes out of big stretches of territory that Rome had lost. He was personally honest. There was no financial self-dealing, no inventing enemies to consolidate his own power, no rot in the palace around him. He did the work. He showed up, and he led from the front for 10 straight years. And the direction was still down, and that wasn't because his decisions were wrong. It was because the plague kept killing people, no matter what imperial policy said. It's because the Germanic pressure came out of the forces that had nothing to do with any Roman decision. And it's because the trust in the institutions had been decaying across generations. Not because of Marcus, but because of the piled-up decisions of everyone who came before him. He was the single most competent emperor that Rome ever produced. And in the end, it didn't matter. He was fighting the current, not the enemy in front of him. The current was the deep structure of the entire thing. The enemies, the plague, and the tribes, and the ambitious generals were just that current kept pushing up against the surface. Every right decision he made bought time, real time too. Something like 10 or 15 extra years of coherence that Rome would have otherwise not gotten. But none of it changed where the whole thing was heading in the end. Because once institutions weaken, everything comes down to individuals. And no single individual is ever enough. And that's not a knock on Marcus or anything he failed to do. It's an observation about what happens when you wait too long to fix the system underneath. The individual becomes the load-bearing piece of the whole structure, and individuals die. And none of this is uniquely Roman. Every generation has its own version of Marcus Aurelius. Not a philosopher-emperor exactly, but a genuinely competent person stuck inside a failing structure, throwing all their individual ability at problems that no amount of individual ability can actually solve. These are people in real rooms, where the real problem isn't the decision sitting in front of them. The real problem is the 20 years of decisions that led to that room. It's the deterioration they inherited instead of caused. The institutional erosion that was already running long before they ever walked in. And they do exactly what Marcus did. They make the right calls, with the right options that they've actually got. They hold the line. They pick the least bad choice available over and over. And the system keeps failing anyway. These people are making good decisions. It's just that individual competence hits a hard wall once the structure itself is actually broken. When a system starts generating problems faster than any one person can solve them, the best leader you can possibly find is the only one able to slow the rate of decline, not stop it. And Marcus understood this completely. The Meditations are basically the record of a man who saw all of that clearly and kept working anyway. He didn't keep working because the work was going to fix anything. He kept at it because he understood that doing your duty, without clinging to the outcome, was the one thing still inside his control. So the real takeaway here isn't the one people usually reach for. Everyone wants to go to find a better leader. What actually matters is fixing the system before it ever gets to the point of needing one. You fix it before the plague ever comes, before the borders ever start to thin, before the machinery of succession quietly rots away, before the institutional muscle that lets the system correct itself has ever been worn down so far that everything ends up hanging on one person's integrity. Because by the time you actually need a Marcus Aurelius, you've already waited far too long. And here's the real tragedy of Marcus Aurelius. A man with that much ability, that much discipline, that much clarity about his own situation, and he still couldn't turn it around. That's the thing that should stay with you. So that brings us to the obvious question. If this is what the peak of the empire actually looked like, all three fault lines already visible, a great man unable to stop the process, then how did old Rome even get here? And to answer that, you actually have to leave the empire behind and go all the way back to the Republic. Because the fault lines that opened up under Marcus were not new in 161. The financial limits that boxed him in, the ceiling on how much revenue you could pull out of the farming economy, the sheer costs of defending a permanent frontier, those were built into the Roman model from the very start. The border dynamic, Rome expanding outward, pressure building out on the edges, and eventually the whole thing reversing. That arc was set in motion centuries before Marcus was even born. And the power question, whether legitimacy would stay in the institutions or shift onto one man, have already been answered way back in the shift from republic to empire. Marcus was just living inside the consequences of that answer. And that's the real story of the Republic too. The decay came first. The structure rotted until bad men could take over, and then rotted further until nobody was able to stop them. The bad men were the symptom, not the disease. And that's where we're headed next. We're going back for the machinery of it, really. For how the whole thing actually worked underneath. Not to hand out blame, not for nostalgia, just to see how it really functioned from the inside. When did the Senate really start losing its authority? When did the army's loyalty begin sliding from the institution over to the individual commander? When did the financial limits of the whole Roman model first start to show? Because if the pattern was already there before the emperors ever existed, and it was, then the autopsy has to begin a lot earlier than Marcus. And that's what's coming next. The Republic itself. The long autopsy of how Rome built the conditions for its own collapse, with 2 full centuries before it actually collapsed. If you want to understand why Marcus Aurelius couldn't save Rome, you have to look at what he inherited, not what he did with it. The answer was already there, waiting for him, before he ever took the throne. This has been The Roman Pattern. I'm Jeremy Ryan Slate. Do me a favor and like this video, leave us a comment, and hit that subscribe button if you want more of The Roman Pattern.